starting. So this morning I'm going to be your tire because Floren's going to go watch some soccer games. What I've got, I forget who asked, but a few weeks back somebody wanted to some instruction on how to deal with goose biots when you're tying small nymph flies. So I'm going to tie two mayfly nymphs. One is the traditional pattern, which is this guy here, which is the prince nymph. That's a prince nymph. And it uses goose biots for the tail and for the wing pads. And it seems to me it's a little more complicated than the other one I'm going to tie because it's got a beard in it. The other one is called an evil weevil. And it's very similar, except it uses a few different materials in it. It's pheasant tail for the tail, goose biots for the wing pads, and it's got some flashback on it. And the dubbing is used, the prince nymph uses just peacock curl. This uses some dubbing. So we'll do both of those. A couple of things off the top of my head. To make your life easier, these are bead head flies. And I got these at a bead store. And you see these little tweezers have little holes in the end. And the thing about that is you can pick up and thread the bead on your hook a lot easier. Now, I'm using these hooks, which is basically a nymph hook. It's barbless with a turned up point, so it'll hold. It's got a relatively long shank. A lot of these prince nymphs and stuff are tied on what I would call a shorter shank hook, and they're more compact in the body and fatter. If anybody's ever read books on mayfly nymphs, there's basically three different varieties you find in the wild. One is called the burrower. And it's a really short, fat little guy, and it lives in the mud. And so it's generally not available to trout as a food. So we're not going to deal with the burrowers. The other ones are the crawlers, and they crawl around usually in faster water, and they're around on the bottom, and they cling on rocks and stuff. And they're not quite as fat and short as the burrowers, but they're still fairly chunky. And those are quite often available to trout due to what's called behavioral drift. And that's where they move and expand their range by letting go of the rocks and drifting down in the faster water. So the fish are ready to look for those. And that's what the prince nymph typically on the shorter hook is. The other ones, if you're in slower water, are the swimmers, and they have a longer, skinnier body. And you'll find those more in lakes as well than you would in streams. And they have a skinnier aspect. So I'm tying these for the lake version of mayfly nymphs, which has a longer shank hook. So you can see it's got a fairly long shank. Bead head patterns. So the first one I'm going to tie is the prince. I'm going to use the same hook for both. Using these brass beads. And for that size hook, a 1/8 inch brass bead is about right. I can fish these things out of the package with my tweezers so they don't have beads rolling all over the place. And you can see, I can see the hole in the bead is parallel to the forceps. And these beads have a wide hole and a skinny hole. And I always put the skinny hole towards the eye of the hook, so I have to put it on first. And I can hold this thing and just thread the hook right through. So that's the beauty of these pliers, is that you can readily put your bead on the hook, even with shaky hands. Put this in the vise with the shank maybe a little bit so that the bead hanging down a little bit at the front, so it keeps the bead at the front. And I'm going to add a little extra weight. These things are going to be fished on the bottom. So I'm going to add a little bit of extra weight, some fairly fine lead-free wire, and I'll do 6 or 7 turns and pinch it off and try to get it relatively flat. Then I'll push this lead wire up into the back of the bead. And get the little tag scrunched down. That helps hold the bead in place. Now, one of the things that we discovered when we were fishing these things on the Red Deer and a couple other rivers in Alberta is that if you have a red butt on them, they seem to perform better. So I'm going to start with red thread right behind the lead, and then I'm just going to cinch it down a little bit, wrapping through the lead, just to make sure the lead stays up in the bead. And then I'm going to wrap my red thread down the hook all the way down to the bend. I'm going to wrap around the bend now with close touching turns and take it right down, sort of halfway down the bend, and make sure I've got a nice red end to this thing. And at that point, I'll just bring the red thread back up the front and tie it off. So that's the red tag. Don't know what it imitates in the natural. It maybe is just a little bit of a strike provoker. Then I'll start my black thread, which is just a standard 8/0, and I'll start that behind the bead. And I will wrap that down the shank of the hook. And part of the reason for having the thread on the shank is that it helps when you're spinning on, later when we're spinning on a dubbing, it helps contain the dubbing where you want it on the shank. Not so much when we're using the peacock girl. Now, one of the things I want to do here is I'm going to build a little bit of bump of thread right at the back of where the barb of the hook would normally be. Not too big a bump, a little bit. Then I'm going to bring my thread up just in front of that bump. The idea is we're going to use the bump to cause the biots to flare out a little bit. These are goose biots. You can use turkey, but turkey tend to be a little bit big. So I'm going to use goose. And I always pull the biot off the end. If you're ever going to use the biots for making a body, you'll see there's a little notch in here. I point it out, this little notch. And you can use that as a notch when you're tying biot bodies to determine whether you're going to get a ribbed body or a flat body. We'll show you that one day. Take the biot with the curved side down, and I will, this is the trick that the guys wanted to see. I'm going to lay it right on top of the hook. I'll measure it first. I want the tails of these prince nips to be sort of gap length behind the bend. So I'm going to lay that down at a 45-degree angle across the hook shank, right where the thread is. I'll take the thread and I'll put it across at a slight angle towards the front, and then just let the bobbin hang. The reason for that is with just a single wrap, I can then take the biot and I can pull it and adjust it in length. So I want about that length, gap length behind, and I can adjust the angle on the hook shank and hold it there with my left hand while I tie down that bit of biot. So now I have that thing on the side, on the far side at an angle sticking out the back. Bring my thread back to where I tied that in. and I will get the second biot off the, you can get it off the full quill, but you can buy these little packages of goose biots that are not horribly expensive. And you'll get enough biots in one of those packages to last you a very long time. I want one of these that's reasonably long. Now, same thing, I'm going to take it and hold it at that 45-degree angle and put it on top opposite way, 45 towards me now, point towards me. Hold it at that angle. I used my index finger to press down on it to hold it in place. And I'll make that first wrap again from the front a little bit to the back, not straight across the shank of the hook. And you'll see that that is enough to hold it in place. And at that point, I can adjust it for the angle across the shank, and I can adjust the ends so that they're even. Then once I've got that and hold it there steady with my finger, I will wrap up the shank and then wrap right back. And you can see now I've got a nice V shape. And it's that single wrap of thread that holds the biot in place that is the key to this whole exercise. You can place the biots exactly the way you want, exactly the length you want, before you have to tie them out. Now, if you've ever seen Davey McPhail's video on how he does this, I think he cheats. I think what he does is he glues the biots together before he puts them on. He puts them on in pairs. It's pretty funny. Now make sure all of the butts are tied down. Now bring my thread back to the same place. And I'm going to put the body in. And the body here is peacock curl. I'm going to use, for this size of fly, I'll pull out of the package, I'll pull 3 strands, say, of peacock curl. 1, 2, 3. And this is pretty fine peacock curl. You can get fuzzier stuff than this, but this is fairly fine. What I'll do is I'll cut just the tips of the small tips off with my scissors and tie that down right in front of where the biots are, right starting at about where the point is, and bring my thread right back to that tie-in point. Now the trick with this is if you've got a rotary vise, this makes it a lot easier, is I'm going to wrap this counterclockwise around the thread about 3 or 4 wraps. And then I hold the thread where my peacock curl is, about 1 inch away, and I will rotate my vise to make the body. Now the beauty of this is that when you're doing this with the thinner peacock curl at the back, you can keep the body of this thick fly fairly skinny. And then as you get forward, you can tighten the wraps up a little bit and make it a little fatter as you get towards the thorax area. When I get to the thorax, I'm going to wrap right up to the bead and then bring it back about a bead width behind. The other advantage of holding on to the thread while you're doing this is you're wrapping the peacock curl with your thread interwoven with it. A couple of wraps in behind there, a couple of wraps in front. And what that does is that reinforces the peacock curl so that it doesn't unwrap if the fish gets his teeth in it. Now the next trick is a little trickier. I want to give it some legs underneath. So I've gone through my partridge and I've pulled out the feathers that have some mottling to them. They're sort of black and gray and a little bit of brown. And I pulled out the smaller ones because I'm just going to use part of this feather. I'll take one of these out. So I've sorted these ahead of time. I will strip everything off this feather from the tip back until I end up with a little bit of feather at the front. And these are going to be the legs of this fly. I'm not going to, now if you saw some guys, they would tie these in as a by the butt and then wrap them. I'm not going to do that. I think this is a little simpler and it works fine. The feather's curved. I turn my fly upside down. I've got to turn the feather upside down so it's curved like that. I will put it in there with my left hand and cinch it down. And I'm going to tie the stem in right behind the bead with a couple of light wraps. Then I'll take the stem and I'm going to pull it forward until the feathers are, the barbs of the feather are just a little bit in front of the point of the hook. Tie that in solid. Trim the butt of that feather off. Get off there. Get it. There we go. I'm going to then take these feathers and I'm going to make one wrap behind them so that they kind of stick straight out from the side of the hook, from the bottom of the hook. At that point, I turn my fly back upside right. And this is where I'm going to tie the biots in. And these are white biots, not the back ones are tan. And these ones at the front are white. And the same thing applies here. Pull the biot off the stem. These are relatively short ones. Anyway, to get a decent length biot. So take one at a time. Once again, curve down, hold at that 45-degree angle, right on top of the hook. I want the tip of the biot to be right at the bend of the hook, back end of the hook. Again, hold it at the 45-degree angle, wrap over top, let it hold it in place. There we go. And again, I want to get the beard underneath. So when I get it in the right place, then I'll get the next biot off the butt of the feather. Sometimes these things, they're hard to get the other one out. There we go. Same thing, 45-degree angle the other way, tip facing me, line it up right where the thread is, over top, one wrap, and then I can adjust this thing to where I want it. Just hold both ends of it until you get the right length and the right angle. And then a couple of good solid wraps to cinch it in place. Lift the butt ends up so I can get my scissors in here and trim them right behind the bead. Then I will wrap over top of the butts with several good wraps of thread to get a little bit of a black collar there. And I've seen some prints patterns where they use red thread there to give it another strike point. And then a whip finish. And to be safe, I'll do a second one. And there we go. And then again, belt suspenders kind of guy. To cement these biots in place, I will use a little bit head cement. Or Sally Hansen's. And I will just dab it right on that top there in between the biots so that they stay there. And that is the print sniff.
Well done.
Any questions? Fairly straightforward fly.
I'm going to be looking at how you did the beard a couple of times.
Yeah, the trick with that is literally you have to go through all of your partridge and pick out the ones that are the small feathers that have a fairly fine stem, and then you strip back what you don't want and you tie it in by the stem, curved so that it's away from the bend. And then again, with the single wrap of thread to hold it on the hook, you can use your fingers to adjust it to the position where you want it. Wrap it down and then pull the beard forward and wrap once behind it, and that'll cause it to stick out. And do that between where the thorax would be and the back of the bead, about halfway between there. Okay, now we're going to use the same hook to do, and the same, this time we're going to use the white biots because we're only going to have a pair of biots for the evil weevil. So I'm going to use the tan biots. I have got, for this one, I've got some 1/8 inch brass beads. It's the same hook. And on this one, I'm going to make sure that when I do this, I'll make sure I have the body all the way back as far as I can on the hook, because I want it to be a swimmer, not a crawler. So once again, I'll get in the packet with my tweezers, find myself a bead. And I'm just going to adjust it so that I can see the small hole. Take the hook and put it through. Whoop, don't do that. Don't drop it on the floor, or then I will never find it. Slide the hook through the hole, and the bead goes on. This is being ornery. There we go. That's why you buy the proper fly tying beads for this, because the bend on the hook, if you don't have the wider hole at the back, it makes it hard for the bead to go around the hole, the bend. Just once again, I want this thing to be sure it's going down. So a little bit of lead wire. Whoops, that's not the lead wire. That's the rib. Where to put my lead wire? There it is. And just hold one with my finger and do 5 or 6 wraps. Yeah. Bend the ends down. Shove that up inside the bead. Bend the other end down with my thumbnail. Once again, start with the red thread. Just wrap in behind the lead to hold it in place so it's not going to slide up and down the hook. And a bit up and through the wraps of lead wire, or lead-free wire in case. And for those who don't know, one of the ways to get these nice wraps around your thread where it covers the hook shank is to hold your tag end up at about a 45-degree angle and wrap, not without too much tension. And what it does is every time you wrap down that piece of tag end of thread, it pushes the wrap up against the next one. So you can get a nice smooth thread body that way if you take your time. Let me get to where I'm going to tie the butt tag in. I will take the tag off and I will wrap the hook shank all the way down and around the bend of the hook till you're almost going horizontal with your thread wraps. And then come back up. Make a nice solid red butt. Thread up to the front and tie it off. I suppose you could use red thread for everything else as well, except you'd have some red peeking through the dubbing, which you might want, I suppose. But for this pattern, I want to use black for the dubbing. So again, change to black thread, start right behind the lead, and I'll open wrap that thing back down to the start point. Now this start point, this time I'm going to take it all the way to the where a little bit behind where the barb would have been. And that's the start point for the fly. Now, the tail is pheasant tail. And because the pheasant tail is fairly fine, to make a decent tail on this nymph, I'm going to have a fair number of fibers that I'm going to pull off the stem. And that just lines up the tips. I want the tail to be a little more than gap length behind where I'm tying it in. I don't want it too long. Wrap over top, loose wrap, cinch it down. So there's the tail. To keep the body even, I'm going to just wrap up that pheasant on the shank, back up to where the thorax is, and then I'll trim it off. Now, at this point, the reason I wrapped that up is it's still got a smooth body underneath and no big lump at the back. And here I'm going to put in the ribbing. The ribbing is going to be a fine gold wire. I'm just going to take that off the spool. These are nice scissors. They've got a little spot. These are a doctor stick. They've got a little spot on the bottom. You see the little half moon shape there? Use that for cutting wire, and then you don't ruin the points of your scissors when you're cutting wire. The wire on the hook, right on the top. Do a couple of wraps, and now when I wrap the wire onto the hook shank, I'm going to let the wire go slightly around onto the far side of the hook. And the reason for that is that I want the first wire wrap over top of the back of the fly to come underneath and then go over the top, not start on top and go around. It makes a nice smoother wrap on top. Now the other thing I've got for this is the shell back. It's this saltwater flashabou. It's kind of a pearlescent, and it's a little wider than the normal flashabou. The original pattern, I think he used something like scudback. This is a guy out of Calgary who developed this pattern. His name is Jeremy Davies, and he used I think like a scudback rather than the flashabou. Anyway, there's a lot of these shellback flies that use this material. I like it because it's got kind of an opalescent sheen to it that reflects light nicely. I'll bring my thread right back up, open spirals right back up to where the lead is again. I'll tie this in by the tip of the flashabou. Come on. No. There we go. Now I want to do the same thing with the thread. I want to hold this thing up flat so that when I wrap over it, as I go down the shank of the hook, the flashabou is on top of the hook and wraps around a little bit on the sides. And I'll do that right down to where the wire is. That's where I'm going to fold forward. And by having the flashabou on top, when I fold forward, it's not going to get a kink in it. Hold it in my material clip. Now, the dubbing that was originally used in the pattern was Arizona dubbing. The two types, the thorax is the dark green peacock, and then there's kind of a golden peacock, and that's okay. I use that, but this is a little harder to get, I think. Now I can get the dark stuff, but I wasn't able to get this. I just had an inventory of that. So over the years, instead, I've used this Canadian dubbing company, Diamond Dub, and it has two colors. They're hard to discern sometimes. This is just plain peacock. It's a little darker than this Arizona, and what's called peacock black, and this is a much darker one. So the abdomen, I'm going to use the regular peacock stuff, and I like this Diamond Dub because it's got a shine to it. It's a synthetic material that has, it kind of glistens in the light. I don't know if you can see it in there. I'll take a little bit of dubbing out of this little box, and the trick with this is don't put it on too thick. So I'm just going to spin this onto the thread. Just do a clockwise with my thumb and forefinger, a clockwise wrap around the thread. Small amounts of dubbing at a time. I don't want to make the thread any thicker than maybe 2 to 3 times the thickness of the thread. You can see that's a fairly thin little piece of dubbing on the thread. The reason for that is I want this to be a fairly skinny abdomen. I don't want to make it too fat. And once I get it there, I'll slide on the thread, I'll slide it right up to the hook shank and make a wrap. And by keeping these nicely evenly spaced wraps, you can control the size of the thorax, the thickness. When I get to that point, now I'm gradually trying to make this thorax a little bit thicker as it goes, a little tapered. So it gets a little thicker and thicker as I get towards the 2/3 way up the hook. And with this stuff, you can kind of, if it looks like it's bulking up, you can give it a spin and pull it a bit and thin it out again, so you can control the way it goes on the hook. Again, a small amount. That's probably enough. When I get to where I had the lead wire on, which is where the thorax is, I'm going to stop with this color of dubbing. Now I'll take the flashback and I'll pull it up and over top, and I'll hold it down with my finger on top and do a light wrap. Make sure it's positioned right on top of the thorax. Do another one. And then I'll pull it back and wrap over top of it and just let it hang for the moment. Then I take my wire. I come from underneath, over top, and I'll do 3, maybe 4 wraps over top of that flashabou and the thorax to give a ribbed appearance to the body. There's 3, there's 4. And then when I get to in front, I will do a couple of wraps on top of the wire just to cinch that down, a couple of wraps to the thorax part, and wrap in front. And if you're good at this, you can do what they call helicopter the wire around, just twist like that. It should break off. And if it doesn't break off, I'll cut it. It's not breaking off. Get in here with my scissors and trim it off. Now at this point, I'll switch dubbing to the peacock black stuff here. And this has a much darker sheen to it. Darker green color too. And once again, small pinches wrapped on the thread. Make a thin, thin dubbing noodle. And don't be afraid to make it skinny enough and use more wraps to give some bulk to the thorax. So I don't know how well the color contrast shows up on this video on the screen, but there is definitely a color contrast between the back and the front of the fly. The back being much lighter in color and skinnier. So I'm build up a pretty good thorax here. These mayflies, when they're a nymph, they have a wing case on them that is fairly bulky, and that's around the thorax. Now, the other reason I'm using this diamond dub is after I've done this, I've got these fibers are relatively long when they get spun on. So when I finally finish up with the fly, I'm going to pick out the legs from underneath because this stuff is not so tightly wrapped. I can't get little bits of dubbing material sticking out from underneath. And that's what gives the fly its legs as opposed to having to do the partridge. Now bring my thread back to the midpoint of that thorax. And this is where I put in my biots. So again, these are tan ones. I'll take a tan biot and do the same thing as before, except this time, instead of placing it dead square in the center and wrapping it, I'm going to leave it a little bit off to the side, on the far away side. It's still going to be that 45-degree angle, wrap over top from back to front a bit and put it in place. I want the biot not to sit right on top of the hook. I want it off to the side a little bit. And you'll see why in a minute. That's number one. I'll adjust it till it's in the right spot. I guess got 2 wraps there. 2 or 3. The last wrap, I gave it a little bit of a cinch. Come on, need to separate that out. Okay. The other biot, the same thing. I want it on the far side of the near side of the hook this time. And on the biot will cross the hook shank a little on my side. And that first loose wrap to get it in place. Get the length right, adjust the length, and then cinch it down. And at this point, I can still play with these things a bit. Okay, that looks good. Now I will pull the butts up like I did on the Prince nymph and trim them short. Now, before I tie anymore, I bring the flashabou up between the biots and pull it down right on top of the hook. So I now have flashabou over the thorax as well as at the back. pull the flash boot back, trim it off, and then come down. And I have these little ends of the biots sticking out, and I don't really care if they show. All I'm going to do is build up enough thread there to make a smooth transition from the head to the thorax and make sure that those biots are in there solid. Then I'll whip finish. And one more. And I will trim the thread off. And then again, a little bit of head cement to make sure that those biots stay where they are, right on the top. And that is Mr. Evil Weevil. The only thing I'm going to do now is I will take my popsicle stick with the Velcro on it, and I will come in here underneath and I will pick out some of that thorax dubbing so that it hangs down. So now you can see I've got some legs now. So that is Mr. Evil Weevil. Now, just to show you the difference between that and the other dubbing, this is what it looks like when you use the Arizona, the tan dubbing and then the dark dubbing. You get a definite color contrast between the thorax and the abdomen of the fly. But I don't know that it makes a difference as to which pattern you use, because I've used both the Arizona stuff and the Diamond Dub stuff, and they both work pretty well. Okay, so let me just stop the highlighting. Spotlight, there we go. So any questions? Comments?
Easy, Dave.
Once again, I learned new tricks by watching. Thank you.
Well, that's the whole point, is to try and answer the questions of how you deal with those biots. I'm just going to stop recording now.
Nice